and self-denial of critical care. Now we'll define the different types of abuse. Physical abuse is defined as a physical injury to or injury which is a variance with the history given of that injury, or unreasonable confinement or unreasonable punishment or assault of a dependent adult as a result of the willful or negligent acts or omissions of a caretaker. Assault. A person commits an assault when without justification the person does any of the following. Commits any act which is intended to cause pain or injury to a dependent adult or which is intended to result in physical contact which will be insulting or offensive to the dependent adult, coupled with the apparent ability to execute the act. Commits any act which is intended to place a dependent adult in fear of immediate physical contact, which will be painful, injurious, insulting, or offensive, coupled with the apparent ability to execute the act. Intentionally points any firearm towards a dependent adult or displays in a threatening manner any dangerous weapon towards a dependent adult. However, the act is not an assault when the caretaker and the dependent adult are voluntarily participants in a sport, social activity, or other activity not in itself criminal. The act is a reasonable, foreseeable incident of such sport or activity and does not create an unreasonable risk of serious injury or breach of the peace. As assault does not have to involve a physical injury, a person can be assaulted and not have any injuries. Physical abuse indicators. Injury that has not been cared for properly, any injury incompatible with history, pain on touching, cuts, lacerations, or a puncture wound, dehydration or malnutrition without illness-related cause, a weight loss, their pallor, sunken eyes and cheeks, evidence of inadequate care, eye problems like retinal detachment, poor skin hygiene, absence of hair or hemorrhaging below scalp, soiled clothing or bed, they have burns, they've been locked in a room, lack of bandages on injuries or stitches when indicated, or evidence of unset bones, or they're heavily or excessive medication. Examples of physical abuse. Examples include unauthorized use of physical or chemical restraints, administration of medications or enforced isolation as punishment or simply for convenience, use of substitute treatment in conflict with a physician's order. The dating of bruises is controversial. There is a difference of opinion between physicians and law enforcement on the validity of the process. What physicians and law enforcement do agree on is that bruises change color as the injury ages, and that having various colors on the same person at the same time indicates separate injuries. The definition of sexual abuse is the commission of a sexual offense under Iowa Code Section 709, 726.2, or 235B.2, while with or against a dependent adult as a result of the willful or negligent acts or omissions of a caretaker. This includes the following categories: first-degree sexual abuse, second-degree sexual abuse, third-degree sexual abuse, detention in a brothel, indecent exposure, assault with intent to commit sexual abuse, sexual exploitation by a counselor or therapist, invasion of privacy, nudity, and incest. Sexual abuse indicators. A person's behavior changes drastically, such as acting out, angry, lashing out, inappropriate affect. A person is depressed or symptoms of other mental health issues. Persons act afraid in the presence of their caretaker. Person does not want to be left alone with the caretaker. They have genital or anal bruises, or they have vaginal or anal bleeding, swelling or redness of genital area, and venereal diseases. Statistics on sexual abuse with persons with disabilities. 99% of persons with developmental disabilities have had no sex education. 83% of women and 32% of men with developmental disabilities have experienced sexual assault. 70% of women with disabilities have been violently sexually victimized at some point in their lives. Sexual assault is not spontaneous or accidental, and communities tend to blame the survivors. It is often treated as scandalous, internal personal matters, or public relation problems. While many of the victims are female, we need to be mindful there are also male victims. Victims are frequently thought to be seeking attention. She wants a special privilege so she doesn't have to follow the rules. That's what his roommate said last month. They all accuse someone. She wants you to feel sorry for her and spend extra time with her. Victims are frequently thought to be asexual or hypersexual. Why is she complaining? She's lucky to get any attention. Who would want to rape someone who drools? He probably doesn't even know what happened. If we teach her about sex, she'll just want to do it. They're thought to be not credible witnesses. People with disabilities lie all the time about a lot of things. If he can't tell us the date, what can he tell us? She giggles whenever she talks about it. People like him have an active imagination. How is sexual abuse different with age or frailty? The lack of strong support system, beliefs about sexual abuse increase feelings of shame and guilt. Money complicate an existing illness. Longer recovery time dealing with abuse. You have an increased chance of substantiating serious injury. Increased genitalia tearing and bruising. Pelvis or hip bones can be broken by friction and weight. You have an increased risk of infection. The definition of sexual exploitation is any consensual or non-consensual sexual conduct with a dependent adult, which includes but is not limited to kissing, touching of the clothed or unclothed inner thigh, breast, groin, buttock, anus, pubis, or genitals, or a sex act. Transmission, displaying, taking of electronic images of the unclothed breasts, groin, buttock, anus, pubis, or genitals of a dependent adult by a caretaker for a purpose not related to treatment or diagnosis or as part of an ongoing assessment, evaluation, or investigation. Sexual exploitation does not include touching, which is part of a necessary examination, treatment, or care by a caretaker acting within the scope of practice or employment of the caretaker. A brief touch or hug for the purpose of reassurance, comfort, or casual friendship, or touching between spouses. The definition of financial exploitation is an act or process of taking unfair advantage of a dependent adult or a dependent adult's physical or financial resources for one's own personal profit without the informed consent of the dependent adult, including theft, by the use of undue influence, harassment, duress, deception, false representation, or false pretenses as a result of the willful or negligent acts or admissions of a caretaker. Financial exploitation indicators. You have a dependent adult is inaccurate, confused, or has no knowledge of their finances. Disparity between income and assets and the lifestyle or living arrangements. The caretaker expresses unusual interest in the amount of money being expended for the care of the dependent adult. Unpaid bills when resources should be adequate. The caretaker is evasive about financial arrangements. Signatures on checks don't match dependent adults. Unusual activity in the bank accounts. Dependent adult turns over financial affairs to someone in exchange for lifelong care, but does not appear to have basic necessities such as food and shelter. Caretaker begins to handle the dependent adult's financial affairs without their presence or without consultation. Examples of financial exploitation include stealing an older adult's Social Security or pension checks, coercion into signing or changing legal documents, or taking or misusing an older adult's property, money, food stamps, or medications. The definition of denial of critical care. The deprivation of the minimal food, shelter, clothing, supervision, physical or mental health care, and other care necessary to maintain a dependent adult's life or health as a result of the willful acts or negligent acts or admissions of a caretaker. Denial of critical care exists when the dependent adult's basic needs are denied or ignored to such an extent that there is immediate or potential danger of the dependent adult suffering injury or death, or the failure to provide the mental health care necessary to adequately treat the dependent adult's serious social maladjustment, or is a gross failure of the caretaker to meet emotional needs of the dependent adult necessary for normal development, or a failure of the caretaker to provide for the proper supervision of the dependent adult. Indicators of neglect is a pattern of failure to provide adequate food, malnourishment, or food in home, food contaminated or spoiled, lack of clothing to adequately provide protection from the weather, lack of heat, unsanitary or hazardous conditions, refusal to provide medical evaluation for condition detected by medical personnel, failure to follow through with medical treatment plan recommended by health professional, unable to manage affairs because of confusion and deterioration, leaving dependent adult who is incapable of self-supervision without a responsible caretaker, knowingly selecting an inappropriate caretaker, or abandonment. Examples of this be withholding of care, medication, food, liquids, and assistance with hygiene. The failure to provide physical aid such as eyeglasses, hearing aids, and false teeth, or failure to provide safety precautions and access to care. The definition of self-neglect is the deprivation of minimum food, shelter, clothing, supervision, physical or mental health care, or other care necessary to maintain a dependent adult's life or health as a result of the acts or omissions of the dependent adult themselves. Indicators of self-denial. They fail to provide adequate food or shelter for themselves. They intentionally physically harm themselves. Their suicidal statements, refusal of medical treatment or medication, and this is based not on religious beliefs. Refusal of services that might alleviate the situation when once would have accepted them. Refusal of visitors, and denial of obvious problems. Examples of this would be they're unable to prepare food or obtain groceries, unable to care for self, confused and unable to understand their living conditions, holes in the floors and walls of their home, or home is cluttered with garbage and it's a health hazard. What dependent adult abuse is not. There are some situations which may appear to be dependent adult abuse, but according to the Iowa Code and administrative rules, they do not apply. The first one is refusal or deprivation of medical treatment based on a religious belief. The practices and beliefs of some religions call for reliance on spiritual means for healing rather than medical treatment. A patient may refuse treatment based on their religious grounds. Withholding, withdrawing, or refusing medical treatment based on a terminal illness. If based upon the request of the dependent adult, their next of kin, or attorney-in-fact, or their guardian. Domestic abuse. Domestic abuse situations where the victim is not dependent as directed in the law. Persons incarcerated in a penal setting. While one could make a case that an incarcerated person is a dependent adult, the code excludes these persons from the dependent adult abuse law. The lack of means or access to means for providing care. Where there is a lack of means to care for a dependent adult, the caretaker would not be guilty of perpetrating denial of critical care. Likewise, cases where a dependent adult lacks the means to care for her or himself would not be considered self-denial of critical care. Facility and programs. This would be reporting to the DIA, so that's our situation. The Department of Inspections and Appeals shall receive and evaluate reports of dependent adult abuse in facilities and programs and shall inform the Department of Human Services of such evaluations and disposition for inclusion to the central registry. Facility means a healthcare facility or a hospital, which includes long-term care facilities, residential care facilities, intermediate care facilities for persons with mental illness, intermediate care facilities for persons with mental retardation, and hospitals. Programs mean an elder group home, assisted living program, or adult day services. The definition of a dependent adult is a person 18 years of age or older whose ability to perform the normal activities of daily living or to provide for the person's own care or protection is impaired, either temporarily or permanently. A caretaker is a person who is a staff member of a facility or program who provides care, protection, or services to a dependent adult voluntarily, by contract, through employment, or by the order of the court. Dependent adult abuse is any of the following as the result of a willful misconduct or gross negligence or reckless act or omission of a caretaker, taking into account the totality of the circumstances. Number 1 is physical injury and unreasonable confinement. A physical injury to or injury which is at a variance with the history given of the injury, or unreasonable confinement, unreasonable punishment, or assault of a dependent adult which involves a breach of skill, care, and learning ordinarily exercised by a caretaker in similar circumstances. Assault of a dependent adult means the commission of any act which is generally intended to cause pain or injury to a dependent adult, or which is generally intended to result in physical contact which would be considered to be a reasonable person to be insulting or offensive, or any act which is intended to place another in fear of immediate physical contact, which will be painful, injurious, insulting, or offensive, coupled with the apparent ability to execute the act. The second one is sexual offense. The commission of a sexual offense under Chapter 709 or Section 726.2 with or against a dependent adult. Number 3 is exploitation. A caretaker who knowingly obtains, uses, endeavors to obtain to use, or who misappropriates a dependent adult's funds, assets, or medications, or property with the intent to temporarily or permanently deprive the dependent adult of the use, benefit, or possessions of the funds, assets, medication, or property for the benefit of someone other than the dependent adult. The fourth one is neglect of a dependent adult. The deprivation of the minimum food, shelter, clothing, supervision, physical or mental health care, or other care necessary to maintain a dependent adult's life or physical or mental health. The fifth one is sexual exploitation of a dependent adult by a caretaker, whether within a facility or program, or at a location outside of a facility or program. Any consensual or non-consensual sexual contact with a dependent adult, which includes but is not limited to kissing, touching of the clothed or unclothed breast, groin, buttock, anus, pubis, or genitals, or a sex act as defined in Section 702.17. Sexual exploitation includes the transmission, display, or taking of electronic images of the unclothed breast, groin, buttock, and anus, pubis, or genitals of a dependent adult by a caretaker for the purpose not related to the treatment or diagnosis or as part of an ongoing investigation. Dependent adult abuse does not include circumstances in which the dependent adult or the dependent adult's caretaker act in accordance with the dependent adult's stated or implied consent, declines medical treatment or care due to the belief or is an adherent of a religion whose tenets and practices call for resilience on spiritual means in place of resilience on medical treatment. The withholding or withdrawing of health care from a dependent adult who is terminally ill in the opinion of a licensed physician, when the withholding or withdrawing of health care is done at the request of the dependent adult's next of kin, attorney in fact, or guardian. Reportable criteria. You must have a dependent adult caretaker. Remember, it is the role of the mandatory reporter to report suspected abuse, and it is the role of the department to determine if abuse has occurred. When in doubt, report. Behavioral indicators. There are a number of victim and abuse behaviors which may indicate the presence of abuse or other serious problems. An awareness of the common indicators will assist a potential reporter in assessing the situation. Behavior indicators of the victim include fear. Fear or reluctance to openly talk with others. They become withdrawn. Acute or situational depression displayed by someone who has not appeared depressed in the past. They appear helpless or resigned. They display an I don't care attitude and appear too accepting of their perceived fate or future. They hesitate to talk openly. They're reluctant to discuss matters related to their well-being, frequently change the subject to issues that are to them non-threatening. Implausible stories, and these are for residents that do not have dementia. Explanation does not match up with the facts or observations. Confusion and disorientation that are not dementia related. Has difficulty expressing thoughts and appears distracted. Ambivalence, contradictory statements, does not show concern about personal events or unable to relate the same explanation repeatedly. They're angry. They may display anger towards you, family, friends, or anger with everybody and everything. Non-responsiveness will not respond